I'm a one-man revolution.
All right, folks, we are back. It's the InfoWarrior with Jason Bermas, and we are now joined with a veteran of the market and finance for over 25 years, the host of The Oracle, and called by many the Michael Moore of Wall Street. Personally, I think this guy's a lot better than Michael Moore, a lot more open and honest. Max Keiser. Max, thanks for joining us.
Oh, Jason, you forgot to tell your audience I'm calling from Paris, France, where it is 5 o'clock in the morning.
That is true. He is very gracious with his time at a unbelievable hour, giving us an hour here. Now, before we get into, current events, the G20, this new quantitative easing, a.k.a. a global currency and all that, why don't you tell people how you get involved in all this?
Well, the same thing, UFOs, unidentified financial objects, I should call them.
So that's what drove you into this?
Yeah. Well, I was on Wall Street during the 1980s. That's when I started my career. And at that time, it was when derivatives, what we now call derivatives, first started, really. And it was an interesting time in Wall Street. It was the bull market of the 1980s, which, of course, led, you had the crash of 1987. And was also an interesting period because I saw firsthand what happens when all of these new products that were created at that time, when they explode. And since that time, we've seen the cycle repeat itself several times. We saw the dot-com bubble build up with all kinds of new products, and then that exploded. There was a huge hedge fund in New York called the Long-Term Capital Management Fund, which was a huge fund managed by guys who had invented these derivative products. That blew up. And saw the WorldCom blow up, and Enron was another example of financial engineering. That was all these newfangled financial products, and that blew up. So what Wall Street's really good at is arson. Basically, Wall Street is run by arsonists. They love to see things blow up. And we're seeing right now the collapse of banking system on a spectacular level, on really an epic level, an historic level. And the guys behind it, the people behind it, have this mentality of arsonists who like to see things explode, and they're exploding. So anyway, my background, going back as a stockbroker in the 1980s, all for the past 25 years, I've always been a kind of a student of how these securities and financial products and financial derivatives are packaged. When I was in Los Angeles in the mid-'90s, I created technology myself, which was a patented technology called the virtual specialist technology. And that technology was used to create something called the Hollywood Stock Exchange, which is a very popular site. And the technology for that ended up being sold to a bond trading company in New York called Cantor Fitzgerald, and they moved that entire they moved the technology to the top floor of the World Trade Center 6 months before the famous events of 9/11. So that's how I've expressed before some insight into the 9/11 events. That's part of the reason why I have some insight into those events. And so I've been observing these technologies. I've created these technologies all the way to the present. To flash forward to the present, Jason, I've just created a new technology and a new. I hear the music coming in.
Yep, we're going to talk about that new.
The first commercial.
Already hit that first commercial. It's a short one here. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about that new technology and the current financial events in the world with Max Keiser. It's the InfoWarrior with Jason Bermas, PrisonPlan.tv, Infowars.com. All right, folks, we're back with Max Keiser, Now, Max, before we get into this new technology, you're also the co-founder of HSX Films, which made almost a dozen films and also ended up selling out to Ignite Entertainment and Lionsgate. I mean, you really are a Renaissance man.
Well, I've been involved in a lot of different things over the years, but the thread of financial engineering, financial architecture, money in markets is constant throughout the various activities I've been involved with. And so it's always been of interest to me. And like I said, it goes back to the early 80s when you had this incredible creative period on Wall Street, which was the result of the work done actually in the 1970s in America is when you had the start of listed option trading in Chicago based on the option volatility formula, which is a Nobel Prize-winning formula that describes how you can price an option and based on the volatility of that option. So it's a mathematical formula that says that if the market is bouncing up and down with a certain speed, then the price of this option is going to be X. If the market's bouncing up and down at a different speed, then the option is going to be worth Y. And this is the beginning, Jason, of the problem, really, because it was then that you saw bankers start to create products that were not based on stocks and bonds as we know them, as we understand them, but based on volatility, based on outlying events, based on things other than the company, let's say, it represents. Instead of buying IBM, for example, you're buying an option on IBM, and then you're buying an option on an option, and then an option on an option on an option. And this is what started 30 years accumulation in the system of what we now call derivatives, which are just, now there's over $500 trillion worth of these things in the system, even though the entire global GDP, the entire global output for the world is not even 1/10 that amount. So the total amount of these derivatives, of these financial products, is 10 times greater than the entire output of the world, and that means it's 40 times greater than the entire output of the United States. And this is the reason why every time Treasury Secretary Geithner throws another $1 trillion into what's called the financial crisis, why it doesn't seem to have any impact, because although he's throwing in $1 trillion and $2 trillion and $10 trillion and $12 trillion, which sounds like a lot of money, the problem is closer to $500 trillion. So he's just throwing, he's showing. I always say showing up to a gunfight carrying a knife. He's just, the scale of the problem is a lot bigger than any of the solutions right now. And this is why the crisis is not going away. In fact, the crisis is getting worse because Geithner is taking such small steps to fix the problem. He's actually just exacerbating the problem, because the bankers are using the money that they're being given by the federal government to create more of these derivative products. And we saw that last week when the announcement was made at the G20 meeting that they're now going to beef up the operations over at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Now, what that means is that they're going to take hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of these derivative products, they're going to repackage them, and they're just going to dump them into the IMF. So they're not going to, in other words, instead of not trying to get rid of them, they're just trying to repackage them and sell them. Why? Because they take a fee every time they do that. So now we just put the problem into another vehicle, the IMF, and it gets bigger. And as has been talked about on your show and other shows over the past couple of years, this is leading inevitably to a situation where you have one centralized bank and one, effectively, a one world currency. And we have a world currency now. It's called a credit default swap, and this is the latest incarnation of all of the financial engineering that's been going on Wall Street for 30 years. It allows for banks to package and repackage and unpackage bundles of worthless paper with each other, and channel that paper back and forth outside of the view of regulators, outside of the view of the SEC, and to conduct the global financial business amongst themselves using this global currency, the credit default swap, which basically amounts to a unit of financial fraud, is what this currency is collateralized by. It's a currency collateralized by fraud, and it's becoming the bigger and bigger business. It's not going away.